My work, I call it a rethinking of the history of the 19th century. The reason I'm calling it a rethinking of the history of the 19th century is because I came across a lecture that Walter Rodney gave at Binghamton University in 1978, in which he made a very, very important point. And he said, look, while historians and social analysts have done a tremendous job in talking about the history of the 19th century, that the basis of their understanding and the basis of their foundation of their analysis is skewed. And he said it is skewed from the basis that they established their analysis lock, stock, and barrel based on the point of view of the planter class. That the ex-slaves, after emancipation, abandoned the plantations en masse. He argued that that did not happen. And he said that the duty of new scholars is to go back into that history and rewrite it. Go back into that history and reanalyze it. So my thesis begins from that point, in which I discuss a number of positions that have been taken, both in relationship to what happened to the African population of Guyana, and that is, I mean, the people who have dealt with the history of Guyana, Alan Adamson, J. Mandel, Rolf Farley, and all these guys. I dealt with that, and secondly, I dealt with people like Eric Williams, Lowell Regatz, and authors like, scholars like that, who place Guyana economically, politically, and geographically in the context of what was happening in the West Indies. My thesis, therefore, begins by arguing that it is wrong to place Guyana in the context of the history of the West Indies of that period, because the West Indian colonies began its process of decline around 1815. The West Indian colonies were no longer required after 1815 to produce sugar for a world economy, because, as Eric Williams argued, economically, right, they were no longer sung to produce sugar economically to compete on the world market. My thesis therefore argues that, on the other hand, the sugar industry in Guyana began in that period and grew from that period. So if you were to look at sugar alone, Guyana was involved in the 19th century sugar revolution when the West Indies was not. From that standpoint, I argue that the marginalization of Africans in Guyana in slavery in the period 1815 to 1838 and after 1838 have to be understood from the standpoint of the growth of slavery outside the British Empire. The growth of slavery in Cuba, the growth of slavery in Brazil, the growth of slavery in the United States. That the growth of slavery in these places was related to the production of sugar, cotton, and coffee for the world market, within which Guyana's sugar was in competition. From that standpoint, I argue that the marginalization of African labor after emancipation have to be understood based on slavery in Cuba and Brazil. What Dale Tomich, my advisor, calls the second slavery in his writings. It is from that standpoint I argue that we have to understand why the African villages stagnated, as Adamson, Farley, and all the historians of Guyana talked about in their works but did not analyze. I argue that the stagnation of the African villages after 1850, everybody agrees that the African villages in Guyana did not rise, stop growing, they stagnated after 1852. I argue that the reason for the stagnation was because labor in Guyana had to be cheapened in that period to match the competition from slave production in another part of the world economy. So I'm saying that what happened in Guyana and African marginalization have to be understood as a manifestation, as a local manifestation of global change within the world economy. It is in that context that I argue that we have to understand the importation of Portuguese and East Indian labor. Because Portuguese, I mean, you know, I went back yesterday and on Friday to reread a thesis that was done by a guy named Michael Wagner at McGill University in Toronto, in which he's talking about the introduction of the Portuguese. And both Walter Rodney and this guy is saying, look, the Portuguese were recruited to create a middle class, a buffer class between the European population and the black population. They were recruited to ensure that the black population, that a section of the black population did not become the middle class that was necessary in Guyana. Let us backtrack here. When we look at the history of Jamaica, right? What we see an African middle class developing even before slavery ended, right? So there was already a buffer class at the time slavery ended in certain places of the Caribbean, right? That was African. In Guyana, there was none of that. And then the Portuguese were recruited to undercut the opportunities of the black population to become a middle class. So by 1848, the Portuguese were owners of all the spirit shops, most of the Solgood shops. Walter Rodney speaks about this in the history of the Guyanese working people. So what happened? What is the contribution of the Portuguese to the defeat of the sugar strike of 1848? When the African workers took strike action in 1848, remember the strike in 1848 was based on the imposition of the planter class. They wanted to reduce wages, right? And to bring wages down to where wages were at the moment when apprenticeship began in 1833. And the ex-slaves took strike action. In the midst of that strike, if people are on strike, they need sustenance. With the disappearance of the Africans from the retail trade, the Portuguese shops refused to give the African population any credit, any food on credit. That contributed significantly in the breaking of the 1848 strike. It was in 1848, we have to remember, while indentured labor was being brought in since 1835, in 1848 was the first year in which the indentured penal contract was established. The indentured penal contract was established, right, as a consequence of the need for labor in Guyana to be made pliable and cheap so that Guyanese sugar could compete with Cuban sugar on the world market because of the Sugar Duties Act, which was passed in 1846, which equalized the duties on sugar, on slave-produced and free-produced sugar on the world market. And it's in the context of that that the penal arrangement that bound East Indian labor to the plantations were established after 1848. So what I'm saying is that we have to understand African marginalization in the villages, the encirclement of the villages, from the standpoint of the penal contract, not from the standpoint of indentureship. Because indentureship was bad. From the standpoint of the penal contract, which tied East Indian labor to the plantations. I mean, and how did that happen? An East Indian laborer, between 1848 and the time indentureship came to an end, could not wander about the country. For them to go from one plantation, they could not go from one plantation to another to seek employment. They were tied to the plantations. If they had to move to another place, they had to get permission. In South Africa, they had passed laws right? In Guyana, they did not call it pass laws. They had to get a special permission, a note from the